Greetings, comrades! Probably every country in the world has a politician whose main distinguishing characteristic is being eccentric. One who makes suggestions that don't seem to make sense, who behaves in ways that real, normal politicians should not behave. Nevertheless, such politicians sometimes make great strides. In modern Russia, Vladimir Zhirinovsky has been such a politician for the past 30 years. His countless antics and crazy statements have cemented his fame as the Kremlin's main buffoon. But who was he, really? A jester and a convenient political pawn? A man who really wanted the best for Russia? Or maybe he was a prophet?
Не надо шутить с войной. Здесь другие ребята.
The most frequent comparison in Vladimir Zhirinovsky's final years was our Donald Trump. There are indeed many similarities: harsh populism, brash and fiery rhetoric, deliberate crudeness of style, inclination toward nationalism. But it's more likely that Donald Trump is their Vladimir Zhirinovsky, because Vladimir Wolfovich was in politics for more than 30 years. He first emerged in 1988 as a member of the Coordinating Council of the Democratic Union, the first openly proclaimed opposition party in Soviet history. 5 years later, in 1993, the Liberal Democratic Party he created literally from scratch won the first parliamentary election in the history of the Russian Federation. So, under different circumstances, Zhirinovsky could have become the leader of modern Russia, but either he couldn't expand his circle of potential voters, or he didn't want to. Let's take a look at how his political career developed. In general, Vladimir Wolfovich's political views are quite difficult to describe. Just look at this picture. The man and his party were literally woven of contradictions. Nevertheless, in 1993 his party managed to come first in the elections to the State Duma, gaining more than 20% of the votes. All the sociologists before the election predicted 6 to 7% for them, which would mean 5th to 8th place. How did this happen? Of course, Zhirinovsky already possessed a great deal of oratorical talent back then, but I don't think that was the sole reason. In my opinion, the LDPR's victory in that election was a kind of protest against the very idea of elections to the State Duma. Let me remind you that they were held in December 1993, just 2 months after the famous events of October 1993, when President Yeltsin literally shelled the previous parliament with tanks and put most of its leaders in jail, albeit temporarily. That is, in fact, people were asking: we elected that parliament, you didn't like it, and now you suggest that we elect a new one? And what's the point? The main opposition forces were not allowed to use the media for campaigning, but Zhirinovsky, who was not taken seriously, was. And he took advantage of it brilliantly. He skillfully appealed to different groups of voters, finding a special approach to everyone. He was indeed a brilliant orator, even though he had no serious political experience before this election. He confidently beat the pro-government Russia's Choice movement, which came as a real shock to the authorities. It was best expressed in a TV speech by the publicist Yuri Koryakin with his exclamation, which can be translated as "Russia, you have lost your mind!"
Россия, одумайся. Ты одурела.
A seemingly brilliant start to a successful political career. Why didn't it work out? First of all, because Vladimir Zhirinovsky seemed like a good option for protest votes, but not the best option for entrusting this man with the role of the head of state. Although it would seem that no one could do a worse job than Yeltsin in his second term, not even a man who pours orange juice on his opponents. Still, Zhirinovsky proved to be too inconsistent and abrupt to be a president. Although, of course, this had its own charm. For example, in his first election in 1991, he used the essentially nationalist slogan, "I want to raise the Russian issue," which was unheard of in those years, after 80 years of communist internationalism. Like Zhirinovsky's behavior itself, people were used to old, calm, measured politicians, not a man who behaves like a rowdy neighbor in a fight at a liquor store. In addition, Zhirinovsky was too eager to show his unwillingness to work both with the left and the right, and as a result, despite having the words liberal and democratic in the name of the party, he spoke out against the breakup of the USSR. In fact, in one speech, Zhirinovsky could speculate about the market economy in a very advanced, liberal spirit, but then abruptly announced that the government still should have full control. In the next, he could talk about the oppression of Russians in the former Soviet republics and the national republics of Russia, and then admire the culture of the peoples of those same republics in the same speech. Even after his death, people were divided on what his views actually were. He spoke out in favor of monarchy and offered to make Putin an emperor.
Самодержавие, царь, император, президенты, название дурацкое, президент, что такое вообще?
Then supported a republican system. He wanted to lift the moratorium on the death penalty and tighten control over corruption, but at the same time he proposed to legalize weapons and completely abolish prison sentences for not serious violations of the criminal code. Zhirinovsky was as vivid as humanly possible, but still too vivid to become a serious contender for the presidency. Zhirinovsky must have realized this himself, that with his radical and very diverse ideas his ceiling in any election was 10 to 15%, and his entire potential electorate was mostly middle-aged provincial men, on whom his flashy slogans really had an impact, and for whom he looked like a real man compared to all those cardboard politicians. That is why Zhirinovsky decided to look for another role, not the main one, but a secondary one. And he found it after United Russia came to power. Even in the 1995 Duma, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia supported the government on all key issues, that is, it was opposition, but only on paper. After 2000, it began to interact with the Kremlin even more closely. Zhirinovsky loved his performances, especially the on-screen part of them. He liked being such an eccentric public figure. But he understood that the screws were being tightened, and soon he would not be allowed to continue his ways, unless he cooperates with the authorities. As a result, they came to a compromise. He was allowed to express harsh ideas and behave deliberately eccentric in exchange for full support of the president and United Russia. At the same time, his deliberate anti-Western rhetoric was in demand in his dealings with the Kremlin. He played this evil clown role effectively, scaring the West. In addition, there is an opinion that through Zhirinovsky the authorities were testing their more extreme ideas that might not be understood by the people. That is, Zhirinovsky expressed some ideas, and the authorities watched the reactions of people. If they didn't support it, then it was always possible to write it off as the old man is being silly again. And if they did, then the authorities would wait for a bit and then present them as a government idea. His penchant for endless stand-up comedy has turned Zhirinovsky from a politician into a character of folklore, the hero of half-fictional stories and anecdotes. For example, he is credited with the words that the Russian soldiers will wash their boots in the Indian Ocean, and the slogan "A man for every woman and a bottle of vodka for every man." And also, "We stand up for the poor, we stand up for the Russians." Some of his monologues must be seen only in the original and without any editing.
Джордж, твоих солдат здесь порвут на части. 250 тысяч отборных солдат Ирака. Джордж, ты ковбой, ты остановись. Это что, Америка, man? Давно уже. Вы что делаете? Моника, какой нахуй президент? Какая война? Какой Ближний Восток? Чики чертовы, анонисты, расы. Не сметь стрелять по Багдаду. Лучше вместе под Тбилиси.
Zhirinovsky built his eccentric image consciously. One of the most high-profile episodes in his political career was his debate with Nizhny Novgorod governor Boris Nemtsov on the television program One on One in 1995. At the beginning of the show, the politicians exchanged greetings with smiles, and in the middle of the show, an enraged Zhirinovsky threw juice in Nemtsov's face. He also threw fights in the Duma, tried to pull Deputy Tishkovska's hair out, poured mineral water at the State Duma speaker, threw glasses at his opponents and insulted pregnant journalists. However, sometimes he got the same treatment himself. In his younger days, he loved making dramatic appearances in crowds, for example, simply showing up at any crowded subway station and starting his speech. Usually the LDPR leader spoke for an hour and a half. In his speeches, as always, he had room for both democratic passages and imperialist ones. This kind of behavior really paid off in the 90s. He did not abandon these habits in his old age. But here he did not limit himself to speeches. He often went out into the streets to hand out money to people, saying peasants, serfs, orphans, who wants another 1,000? Or tried to get into fights with participants in a rally against pension reform. Throughout Zhirinovsky's political career, there was a theory about his connection to the special services. They say that back in the Soviet Union, KGB wanted to control potential protest sentiments in the USSR, and for this purpose they created a party that would be formally oppositional but under the full control of the authorities. Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB general who fled to the United States and was convicted in absentia by Russian authorities in 2002 for treason, spoke about that several times.
До сих пор активно действует Жириновский, Володь.
I understand why this version is plausible. The LDPR really was the perfect party to drain the discontent of the deep people. Neither the half-dead CPRF nor the faceless parties like Just Russia could do such a thing. Moreover, Zhirinovsky frequently criticized the authorities and even threatened them with revolutions. But when his strong and harsh words needed to be backed up with deeds, the LDPR always seemed to shy away. That is, they had a limit to which they were allowed to oppose the government, but they never crossed it. They did not vote against the extremely unpopular pension reform of 2018. And when a member of their party and the popular governor of the Khabarovsk region was arrested, Zhirinovsky first supported the protests in Khabarovsk, and then, on instruction from the Kremlin, quickly condemned them. Of course, politics is a dirty business, but politicians usually do dirty things in order to get to the top. And Zhirinovsky, it seems, engaged in them purely for the pleasure of the process itself. Sometimes he seemed so frantic that one suspected that this was no longer a game for him, that he really had gone insane. If we look at the statements of people who knew Zhirinovsky personally, again, it is impossible to put together a coherent picture. Some claim that Zhirinovsky acted like a boor and a bastard in all circumstances, while others claim that, on the contrary, he was the most intelligent man in a private setting. Some of them believe that he had firm convictions that he did not reveal, while others say that he did not have any beliefs of his own at all, except his thirst for pleasure and pathological desire to be in the public eye. That after all the TV cameras were turned off, it was as if the batteries were taken out of Zhirinovsky and he became a calm and tired old man. All this really confirms the theory that his purpose was never power, but something else. Time on TV for his own pleasure, or some unknown mission from the KGB. You decide for yourself. But I would like to pay attention to another thing, which began to be noted after Vladimir Wolfovich's death. About his prophecies, which came true with amazing accuracy. Here, for example, is his speech from mid-2021.
Лучше будет 22 февраля в 4 утра 22 года. Ну и вы почувствуете. 4 часа утра 22 февраля. Я бы хотел, чтобы 22 год был бы годом мирным, но я люблю правду. 75 лет говорю правду. Это будет год не мирный.
A 2-day difference is nothing, considering that at the time no one believed that the invasion was possible at all. In 1999 he correctly predicted the further eastward expansion of NATO. In 2004 he predicted the coming to power of Barack Obama in the US. In 2008 he predicted the imminent bombing of Lugansk and Donetsk and the transfer of the Crimea to Russia. And in 2012 he predicted a revolution in Ukraine due to the stupidity of Yanukovych. Hell, Zhirinovsky predicted even partial mobilization 7 years ago, although even that concept did not exist in Russian law until the fall of 2022. Naturally, detractors simply explain this as Zhirinovsky had a big mouth. At least something out of this was bound to come true. But is it all so unambiguous? After all, Vladimir Putin made a pretty good point.
Просто выдающимся политическим деятелем нашей страны, очень разносторонним, с такими большими глубокими знаниями. Отсюда и его некоторые пророчества, которые сбываются.
Zhirinovsky could be considered anything. A drug addict, a scoundrel, a big fan of young men and a boor. But it was obvious that he was far from stupid. That is how vivid and contradictory Vladimir Zhirinovsky's career has been. And as cynical as it may sound, his death was the perfect conclusion to it. Vladimir Zhirinovsky was an ardent supporter of the toughest possible measures against COVID-19 and was himself the first Russian politician to be vaccinated. In total, he was vaccinated 8 times with different vaccines, often live on air. And yes, you guessed it, he died of complications from COVID after 2 months in hospital. Although many people were so used to expecting anything from Zhirinovsky that a theory emerged immediately that he didn't actually die, but simply faked his hospitalization in February 2022 and left the country just in time. Thousands of people came to say goodbye to him. People who could genuinely say, "Rest in peace, Vladimir Wolfovich, you were fun to be with." That's all for today, and a big thank you to Stick221, Steven, Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berze and Giovanni Zayas.